Jackson Cook.
Fairleigh Cook Jackson.
Fairleigh Cook Jackson. FCJ. You should start calling yourself that. And we have been trying to have this conversation for a very long time. And what I was saying earlier is that when you and I get on the phone or wherever we talk, it's just like a gaggle a minute anyway. And so we're going to do our very best to have an organized, thoughtful conversation that doesn't typically happen between us. We have thoughtful conversations, but they're not organized, right? So today we're going to talk about white folks in universal histories. And it's funny that you said, like, us using the term universe might have been the thing that conspired against us. But I do think the conversation is important. So before we get started, I kind of just wanted you to have a chance to say, like, why you think this conversation matters and why you wanted to be the featured guest on episode 6.
All right. Well, professionally, as executive director of Preserve Louisiana, our mission is architectural, but also cultural preservation. And that means, telling the full narrative of the past. And, what we've seen and what I see personally is that hasn't really been done. Until recently, it hasn't been focused on. It has not been a priority, to say the least. And, now I think it's more important than ever when we have government leaders and people in leadership positions that are trying to kind of stop these really important discussions about telling the full past and the full narrative.
Okay. All right. Is there anything you want the audience to know about you before we get started today?
I feel very passionate about this work. And I really love to roller skate.
Awesome. So the first question I want to ask you is, again, for the listeners and everyone who's going to see this on YouTube and stuff, Fairleigh has this amazing definition of history. And I was lucky enough that she shared it with me and, during a really engaging conversation we had a while back. And that's part of why I wanted us to have this conversation, because I was like, Fairleigh, everyone needs that definition. So let's start there with your own personal Oxford style definition of history.
My non-Webster style.
Your non-Webster. It's much better than Webster's definition, if you ask me.
Well, I think we should talk about Webster for sure.
Okay, I'm ready for it.
But what I would say, I'm trying to get myself situated because I think I'm having computer issues and my phone wasn't charging. So I know that this is not the best background, but it is what it is.
Okay. It's life. It's 2020
It is life. It is life. But I do have a brand new refrigerator. So
yay.
Thanks to
and
my
the
parents.
lighting is working. The lighting works for you. So there's that.
Okay. Well, so when you talk about a definition of history, I don't know that it's necessarily my definition of history or my tendency to even ignore the term history, because, history, if we just break down the word and we're just talking about the vernacular, it's his story or his story. So right there, we've got, a culturally or economically dominant culture that is writing this story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then just the fact of the matter that it's a story. So what I prefer to look at is the past. And the past, by definition, is everything that actually happened up until this point in time. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, it's more of a rejection of the term history and an embracing of the term the past. And even when we say the full narrative, I have an issue with that, because a narrative also, again, implies one perspective.
One major storyteller, or at least there's a perspective that gets to be dominant and gets to be pervasive, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if we talk about, Webster, because you brought him up, Noah Webster, who is...
Okay. About to drop some facts. All right.
Basically, between him and Miriam, but he started it, has dominated our language, right? I mean, that's where we go for our language and the definitions of our terms. But when you actually look at Noah Webster, he was not only the creator of our most widely used dictionary, but he was also a writer of American history. And if you look at the American history books that he wrote, there's a significant amount of information missing. And it is all about Black history. In fact, in most of his books, and the most widely used books, he really just refers to slavery in a term of policy and never talks about the abolitionist movement or anything like that. So he's one example of how, a culturally dominant entity writes history. So,
it's funny because, I'm going to give us a little bit of a ramble, but we're going to come back, back to our questions for today. But it's interesting you talk about language and the role that language has, because there's a theory called linguistic relativity. Viewers, y'all are getting a lot of new language. I'm excited for y'all. It's a theory that, for the most part, I don't want to get into the history of it, but it says that the language we have access to gives us a view of reality, and it shapes our reality. And so when I talk about this, usually what I point to is how many words do we have for snow in our United States culture? So let me ask you that. How many words do we have for snow?
Gosh, if I had to guess, I mean, I'd say in the hundreds, probably. Is that
in our English language?
Oh, okay. I'm thinking snowflake, flurry. Like, I'm thinking all of the.
Well, yeah, but see, those are describing states of
the
it,
type
right?
of snow.
Yeah.
Okay,
but
so
really, there's just
one
the
word for snow. Okay, I gotcha. I'm picking up what you're putting down. Okay.
Yeah, but when you think about like the Inuit culture, right? There's at least 13 words for snow, right? And it makes sense because snow is such an important cultural value. Another example to think about this is like within Hindu culture, right? In our English language, there's only one word for my mom's sister, and that's aunt, right? But in the Hindu language, there's a word for first aunt, second aunt, third aunt, youngest aunt, right? And it again tells you just how important of a value that is. So the language we have access to and the words we have really say something about our views, our perspectives, and what is valued. Because if I turn around and ask you how many words do we have for money, the list goes on and on and on. You know? So anyway,
I was just going to add, I mean, language is, and this could be a whole nother,
I know,
series. But I mean, it is literally the one thing that sets us apart as a species from every other entity on this planet.
Yeah.
And so I think to embrace the real emotional and historic value of words is something that is important. And I mean, maybe it's because the English language is one of the newest languages, I mean, that could be it too. And, we're babies,
Yeah.
like,
but don't tell that to our neighbors.
Yeah.
They think we run the world like Beyonce.
Well, I mean, we've managed to colonize a good part of it and still are, so.
That is true. Again, if you want Zoom to keep working, you need to be on your best behavior, friend.
I'm sorry. Are they going to cut us off if we start talking like this?
You know, who knows? So you tell us that the term you appreciate and value is the past.
Yes.
And that allows for what I imagine is multiple voices, multiple perspectives. You know, another thing that I think is really important, that sometimes with history and the dominant narrative, we only see things in terms of black or white, either or, that binary positionality that occurs because of history. And so when I think about your definition of the past, I think that is so much more fluid and dynamic. And it would,
yeah, I think so too. Well, I was just going to say, because even within what we just mentioned, like, there can also be a monolith within one entity of that, you know? And so, you know, everything that happens up until this point would reflect everything that happened from every perspective, you know?
yeah, not just one.
Right.
Why do you think, you know, it's interesting because I don't think it was until I got older, you know, as a, probably in my 30s, that I started to think about history, family history, national history, regional history. Why does something that happened in 1787 matter now?
Well, I mean, I think there's a multitude of reasons. And, you know, I think the reason, like what you're talking about, that happening in our 30s, I think that's when it started to happen for me as well. And I think it's a search for identity, you know, and where did I come from? Not only where did I come from, why is my world the way it is, and also why is this larger world the way that it is? And so we're trying to, you know, have answers to all the complex questions about everything, you know, and so I think that's why it's important. We don't really understand where we are unless we know the significant things that happened in the past. And I think, to take that even further, because of the lack of education around the Black history in the United States, there's so much misinformation for people to not understand, like, what systemic racism is, you know, all of these things. If you haven't studied or known about where we went, I mean, it's like, you know, it's not that slavery just ended and everything was hunky-dory, right? Like, but that's what people are taught, you know? And so I think that's where there's a serious lack of understanding and a lack of what I would call emotional and cultural intelligence around this, you know? So I think that's, I don't know if that's answering the question, but
well, no, I think it does. I think the idea is that history matters because we're going to repeat things, whether those things are great or whether those things are bad, if we don't have a thorough understanding of them.
Yeah, well, and understanding why certain policies are in place, you know, like, I think that was one of the issues with affirmative action, is like, people didn't really fully understand, you know, that was needed to, or is needed to, actually address things that happen historically, you know. And if you really don't have a full grasp of that, you're going to fight against it, you know, and you're not going to understand it, and you're not going to acknowledge why something like that is necessary. You know, you're not going to understand why, you know, it's important for people to have diversity and inclusion training if you really don't understand that systemic racism is present and the way that it is present and has been present.
Yeah, which I think it leads to, like, this next question, which is, like, there's this African proverb that goes sort of, it's similar to this, that the story of the hunt would be different if the lion could speak.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that proverb makes me think, you know, another similar one is history is written by the winners, which I think that's a little faulty, you know, because who we define as winners now, like Christopher Columbus.
Well,
when you contextualize
yeah.
it.
but the current winners define who the winners are, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think that's important too, is like, winner is always subjective depending on who's in the culturally and economically dominant position.
Yeah.
You know,
And
so
what's the culturally appropriate conversation that one can have too? Could you imagine? So the year is 1865.
mm-hmm.
The Civil War has ended.
Mm-hmm.
And the country is devastated. And people from the North and South were trying to pack their lives up and reassemble their lives. I mean, I think a lot about, and I feel like I've talked to you a lot about this. You know, the Civil War got rebranded in a huge attempt to reconcile without a full acknowledgement of the wrongs. And even now, trying to look for slave narratives and slave experiences, you know, usually one of the first things that show up, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? But it's the, oh gosh, I know the term for it. When the people went around the country in the Great Depression
Mm-hmm.
and interviewed the former enslaved. It was that project, it was a federal project.
Tina, I don't even remember the name of that.
But you know what I'm talking about,
yeah,
right? Oh my gosh.
yeah.
WPC?
Yeah,
Was it WPC?
it might have been.
I
want to Google it right now.
Yeah.
Somebody Google it and post it in the comments. Greg, Google it and post it in the comments.
Yeah, we're going to Google it. And then once we get the name, we're both going to be super embarrassed because we're going to be like, how did we forget the name of
I know. Right? Well, hey, you know, there's only so much bandwidth sometimes. Yeah. You know,
but
it's like,
those are slave narratives that were comprised because, you know, the Library of Congress, but what administration? Was it Roosevelt? But the president administration decided that one of the ways they were going to give people jobs, the Federal Writers Project. And the administration and, you know, decided that this is how we're going to give some people jobs. It started in 1936. And they sent out people to interview like that last generation of people who had been enslaved in the United States. And so a lot of those people were like in their 80s, you know, in their 90s, and had been children when the Civil War had ended. And what's interesting is that so many people have critiqued those narratives because they say, what do you think somebody who was born enslaved in the United States would tell a white person about their slave experience, right?
Yeah.
And what do you
critiqued in the way that they were not completely honest about the
So that's what I'm saying. So a lot of people have pushed back and said that this is a great project and intention was great, you know what I'm saying, to record these last parts of a history. But you're asking a traumatized people to look in the eye of the people who look a lot like
their oppressors.
And then this is also like heavy Jim Crow too, right?
And we're entering the like period of serious intimidation at this point.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because some people would point to that and say, oh, well, that's the truth because it came straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But then again, that's why the past is such a powerful metaphor here, because we still have to investigate the context. You know what I'm saying?
That's it. I mean, well, and I was just going to say that's such an emotional response also. I mean, again, that it's a narration that is influenced by all the things that you just mentioned. Plus, like, as humans, you know, we have mechanisms within us to protect ourselves from reliving trauma, you know? And so I think that that's important too. Not just that the person that is their oppressor is sitting across from them interviewing them, but also like to relive that is to relive trauma. And we protect ourselves against that. It's like, I think it's every time we have something bad happen to us, and I'm not comparing something right now to,
Yeah.
you know, living for, right. But we're going to tell that in a way that protects us from going back to that place, you know? So I think that's important too. So those, while they're important, I agree with you that it's not really an accurate account of what happened.
And the only reason why I bring that up is to again say that even in the instance where you did have people who directly experienced enslavement tell their truth, it still needs to be contextualized and it still needs to be given a framework, you know? And I think because systemic violence is so prevalent, getting to the honesty of a moment is really, really hard.
Yeah.
You
well,
know?
it takes, I mean, there's the gift of the interviewer, right? I mean, there is, I mean, I hate to say it, but it's like, you know, the journalists that run the debates, you know, it's setting up the scenario to get an actual answer and all of that. Nobody was interested in that during that time, you know? I mean, again, it's hard to look at those and think that they would even be an accurate account other than a small glimpse into the inhumanity, you know? Yeah.
And I think kind of like where I originally posed this idea is that because that honesty is so hard to grasp, it's that much easier to create a whole different reality. So when we're thinking at the end of the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, it was like, I don't want to sound like a apologist for the South, right? So I'm trying to really frame my words well, but everyone was traumatized. And I wonder, like, when the former Confederates decided to make the Civil War not about slavery, but to remix it and rebrand it about states' rights.
Right. I was about, yeah.
Right? Like, how much easier was that? Was it easier for white mothers who had to bury their sons to take that part of it? You get what I'm saying? Because the truth of it would have been too overwhelming or too, you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
Even in the pursuit of truth, people still, the fantasy can be attractive for multiple reasons. Because what would have happened if those moms who had buried their son, especially poor moms, right? Because that's another part of the Civil War we don't really talk about. We assume that everybody was like Scarlett O'Hara's dad, Jared O'Hara.
Yep.
And I don't think we'll ever have the numbers of how many poor whites died on, you know, those battlegrounds.
No.
But to have known the truth of that matter might have been too much for even the daughters of the Confederacy.
Well, I mean, and that was all about like white supremacy, you know, not even just slave ownership or upholding slavery. I mean, it, you know, I mean, even again, to go back to Webster and other writers, I mean, they wrote that, you know, they felt superior, you know, I mean, so it is interesting that there was a shift to the states' rights kind of, well, and then we see that shift also from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, right? So, I mean, we've seen this total
completely topsy-turvy, yeah.
Wow. Which, you know, we've all heard lately, you know, that's always an argument is like, you know, well, the Democrats, you know, were the ones that fought for slavery. And yeah, I mean, you can't ignore the actual history and the change in that. And I think it was very much aligned with the states' rights. I'm kind of getting off topic here.
Yeah, it's okay.
Big government, small government, all of that. But yeah, I mean, those poor white people, you know, economically disadvantaged white people.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to be like, it sounds like what I'm saying. The poor white people, you know.
Poor white people, bless their hearts.
The poor white
like,
people.
Though they were literally poor.
Yeah, they were literally, yeah. But yeah, what were they fighting for? And I really think it was to regain or to retain superiority.
Yeah.
Because even if they were poor, they were better than someone else.
Because they were still white.
Because they were still white.
And that narrative, does it still exist in 2020?
Oh, well, hell yeah. I mean, I think that is, you know, when we look at people voting for, you know, an administration or people who, you know, create significant tax breaks for the upper echelon of people that are, you know, have the highest incomes, and they're not even actually voting for what is going to economically help them and give them an advantage, that is like the clearest example that this mentality has not gone away.
If I'm nothing else, I'm white.
I'm nothing else, I'm white.
And so the ultimate investment is that, right?
I think for many people, yes.
Can you tie that to this idea of universal histories? How do universal histories, like one side of the story, reinforce that white investment?
Well, I mean, it kind of goes back to what we were saying, you know, when you don't understand a full history of, or the full past, you're going to continue to inform your decisions based on what you've been told, you know, and so, you know, people aren't getting the full context of, well, and, you know, I don't even want to say it's only about the past, Kina. I think it's about the present as well. And
what do you mean by that?
I mean, you know, and I hate to sound so cheesy and cliche, but it's like, you know, rising tides lift all ships, right? Like there's so many things that show that equity, diversity, and inclusion is beneficial across so many levels for societies, you know, whether it's economic, productivity, creative thinking, all of those things, you know.
That's one of the things that I argue in this in the Hug Your White Friends project, right? Is that whiteness is dangerous for white people too.
It
right?
is. It
Just
is.
like patriarchy is dangerous, like toxic patriarchy, toxic masculinity is dangerous for men, right? Yeah. You know, heteronormativity is dangerous for straight people, right? Mm-hmm. So the people who are within the dominant culture and part of the dominant narrative are also adversely impacted by these violent systems, and simultaneously get benefits as well.
Right. So there's the benefits, and then we're also leaving out the whole fear factor, right? Mm. And there's a narrative there that prevents everything we're talking about from happening, right? It prevents people from acknowledging everything that you just said, that I said. And that fear factor is, I mean, now we're not even talking about history or the past. We're talking about
rising, right?
and honestly, the media, you know, and how language is shared now in a modern day time, right? And you know, it's many times that you hear people say, I think I mentioned to you, there was a friend of mine that posted about the election, and someone said, you know, if Biden wins, we will lose everything our forefathers fought for. And I said, like what and how will you lose them? And people can't even answer that question, right? But it's still like this narrative of what our forefathers fought for. Like, how many times do we think that has been sung throughout, you know, the ages? And it's like, what did they, well, yeah, I mean, that's.
Yeah, we'll be here all day because
I know.
Sometimes I, you know, it's interesting because I don't think most people don't really know what the forefathers fought for, right? And even when we're thinking about conversations around voting rights and representative democracy, the truth is the 39 white guys that met that summer in Philadelphia never had any intention on this being a representative democracy and wanted to find ways to make sure that it never would fully manifest like that. Like
Well,
there's
and then
just so
let's
much
take it.
data that there's so much data that proves that.
Well, and then take it even further to the Electoral College when, you know, Southern states were arguing for, you know, the enslaved to be counted. I mean, like,
Yes.
it's like it's unbelievable to think about, you know? Like,
I like to think that the democracy we've got is democracy they planned.
I
Okay,
mean,
so
well, but I don't think that they intended it to be definitive, and yet we've made it definitive, you know? I mean, I don't know, maybe that's my, you know, Pollyanna version of I don't want to think that anything that I create in this world is the end all be all.
well, static, right?
Thank you, static. Because, I mean, the world is kinetic and things change and evolve and circumstances change.
Don't let your new Supreme Court justice hear you talking about that.
Yeah, well, constitutionalist, I mean, you know, I mean, that's a whole nother thing, you know?
It's what
I mean,
the forefathers meant.
Damn it. You know,
How
I mean,
do we do history differently?
oh, what a good question. You know, I think it really starts with education, you know, and I mean, I hate to say that, it feels like everything, you know, but so much of what we do talk about goes back to education.
Okay, Miss America.
I know, right?
You know, Miss America's like, and the answer is education.
I know, it sounds so
and world
stupid.
peace.
And world peace. Yeah. But, you know, I mean, I really do. I mean, I think that, you know, we have to have the full past taught, you know, from a standpoint, obviously not of the whitewashed version, the full past, but then also like how these, you know, serious and significant times in our past have impacted very real day-to-day life. And I think that you had touched on this a little bit ago, but I think that's the disconnect, right? Is like how the past actually affects what is happening right now. And those lines aren't drawn, those connections aren't met, those dots aren't, you know, connected. And I think that's the biggest thing. And it's tying all kinds of things together. You know, it's history with policy, even literature. I mean, you know, there's so many things that are left out in that, in our education. And I'm not just talking about elementary. I mean, I'm talking throughout academia, you know. I mean, you and I were just talking about the new college that's being created at LSU that some of your colleagues have been working on for this to be a major.
Yeah, African American Studies.
I mean, the fact that
African and African American Studies. So,
I mean, the fact that hasn't been created until now, that's an issue. You know, because I mean, and I don't know a lot about what this all would entail, but it seems like a lot of what we're talking about would be discussed, right? I mean, you're leaving out so much about policies that have been in place for decades, and, you know, systemic and institutional racism that has not been touched because nobody has made those connections in the minds of young people. You know, everybody else, they just kind of gotta die off. I hate to say it, but you know,
I'm gonna up the ante a little bit here, because the question we're talking about is how do we do history different?
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's fine. No. It's just that I'm gonna make this a little bit personal, and hopefully you don't want to punch me in the throat the next time you see me. But you're a mom.
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. And your kids go to school.
Yes.
And they come home with activities and books and narratives all the time. So what do you do when your kids come home and present something that you know has a clear bias or is faulty, like faulty claims? What do you do with that information?
Well, mostly I don't see faulty or biased claims. I just see total like exemption, like it's not even talked about. So, I mean, as a mom, you have to supplement that.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like that should be our role as parents, but it is what we have to do. So,
and so
I mean,
that's what I was trying to get to, right?
Yeah.
Like that's another level of the doing
Yeah.
is calling
It
out
is.
the mistruth, calling out the lie, calling out the exemption. You know,
Yeah.
how many parents a couple weeks ago, the kids came home talking about Columbus. How
Yeah.
many parents contextualize that?
Yeah. Well, and that's the hard thing. And then it's, you know, even if you do contextualize it, not everybody has the same toolkit or, you know, bandwidth to do it, or let's just be honest, the time, you know, I mean, so it's very unfair to put this on parents. I mean, I think we all have a role and we do what we can. I mean, I absolutely do, but this should all be talked about in school. I mean, and that's the thing is like, we need to move from his story to the past, you know, I mean, because until we take away the dominant voice, and whether that, again, culturally, economically, both, it is such a narrow view of what actually happened.
I mean, also, I think that all of those different puns and rhymes need to get remixed. So in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and what rhymes with murderer?
Maybe that's it, Kina. Maybe it's just that the whole wax poetic is too challenging.
This has been a great, great conversation.
I've really enjoyed it.
I don't think this will be our last. This will not be your last feature on Hug Your White Friends. I'm so thankful to have you on episode 6. I'm so thankful for the truths that you've given me outside of this episode. I'm also glad we were able to record and post this prior to the second Civil War that might be approaching any day now.
Let's hope it's not that. Let's hope we have an answer on November 4th. Like that. Let's just hope that by next Wednesday, people have peace of mind. I know that is probably not where everybody is. And there's a lot of our mutual friends that have been way more optimistic than I am. And so I'm looking at them and looking to them for those, you know, but, you know, I'm not a Buddhist and I'm not.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've been training myself to do, again, because 2020 for me feels a lot like 1865, right? Like, especially Reconstruction era, and having a president, and I'm going to say this on video, you know, come at me if anybody wants to. I'm a big girl. Having a president that also didn't want Black people in the country, right? And so it goes back to like telling one part of the story. Everyone loves the narrative of Abraham Lincoln who freed the slaves, right? No one talks about the Abraham Lincoln who was like, the problem with Black people.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's another one that.
Where can we send them?
Well, and he totally bought and communicated the superior narrative as well. So, I mean, yeah.
And so until we can get to what I like to call is the both and, right? Abraham Lincoln can be the president who freed enslaved people, and also the president who wanted Black people to leave the country because he didn't think that Black people and white people can live together in harmony. Right. So I think once, like, you call it the past, and, you know, the comm scholar in me calls it the both and, being able to start to recognize that tension.
Yeah.
So, yeah, 2020 feels like 1865 because there's another president who's like, the Black people. But I also think, I mean, all jokes aside, new Civil War, old Civil War, whatever, the past can teach us how to get it right this time in terms of what reconciliation could really look like, because I do think we need that, because I don't think it's ever occurred, right? Like history keeps giving us these chances to do reconstruction again.
Yeah.
And so,
well, so there's a huge accountability factor there, right?
yeah.
Like that, let's say things go to a point where we do feel like there's leadership that has made these promises and has said that this would be a focus. I mean, like, we don't wake up on January 21st or 22nd and say like, awesome, done. You know, it's like, hell no, that's when the work starts to keep people accountable, to make sure that, like, you know, what's the term that's so catchy right now? Like, there's no going back to brunch, you know, like.
That must be a white lady thing.
Of course it is.
I want it on a t-shirt. I want it on a t-shirt.
There's no going back to brunch, you know, and it's like, you know, and it's funny because people have really funny responses to it, and they're like, yeah, I know there's no going back to brunch, but can we do the work over brunch because I'm really ready for a mimosa? And it's like, no, like, there's no going, like, that's when accountability and like detailed analysis of policy and everything comes into play. Like, that to me is like where like the nitty gritty work starts happening. You know, I know for me, from a historic preservation standpoint and all the work that we do on the federal level, we see a lot of opportunity. You know, we're one of the biggest funders of civil rights grants across the country. We're one of the biggest funders of preservation for HBCUs. And so we have a lot of high hopes. You know, it's like if things go the way that we hope they do and the way that we've been advocating for, like, you know, it's up to everyone to not stop working. And I'm sorry, I'm sounding very, like, I'm mostly talking to white people here. Tina, you know that.
Well, yeah, that's what the project is geared to. So you're fine.
Well, I mean, I am talking to all you white people. Like, you know, this is it. Like, you know, it doesn't stop.
Yeah.
It gets more intense, I think. So
and I think that is a perfect ending to an amazing conversation. Stay
this was
well.
great. Tina, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Take care.
You too.
All right.